1 billion COVID-19 vaccines and a pledge to continue funding development across Africa. But can China avoid criticism over taking advantage of natural resources and saddling developing nations with unsustainable debt? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sahil Rahman. Welcome to the programme. China's President Xi Jinping has promised African nations 1 billion coronavirus vaccines and has pledged to continue economic investment in the region. Xi made the comments virtually as part of the annual forum on the China-Africa cooperation as the two-day summit in Senegal comes to a close. China emphasised how crucial the partnership is. China is Africa's largest trading partner with nearly $190 billion in trade. So let's take a closer look at China's long-term investment plans in Africa. Chinese foreign direct investment in the continent was almost $3 billion in 2020, totalling almost $50 billion overall. Almost a third of that investment has gone into the construction and infrastructure development areas. Now that's helped make China Africa's biggest trading partner. It's also given China premier access to much-needed raw materials to fuel its economy. It's the largest importer of copper and cobalt from Africa, most of it extracted by Chinese-financed companies. But this investment has also come with a heavy debt burden. Chinese finance comes with an average 4.2% interest rate, far higher than other international options. Well, let's bring in our guests now. Joining me from Nairobi is Hassan Kanenji, the director of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. In London, Anthony Goldman, he's the head of Pro Media Consulting, which advises companies and institutions on business and political risk in Africa. And from Beijing, China, we have Andy Mock, a senior research fellow at the Centre for China and Globalisation. A warm welcome, gentlemen, to all of you. Mr. Kanenji, can I just give you the first question? I mean, to understand China's contact with Africa, we have to sort of go back to its origin and first contact, you might say, between the two continents nearly 500 years ago, back in the 15th century. Early trade was that initial contact that they had. It was very important and it still remains important today.
Yeah, it is indeed true that the interaction between China and the African continent go back hundreds of years ago at a time, of course, that preceded colonialism. And this is something that is also been established based on the evidence of Chinese presence along the African coast and along the East African coast that actually go back further, about 1,000 years ago. Now, the transactions were significantly modified, of course, in the period following the Second World War, in which, after the coming to power of Mao Zedong, the Communist Party saw it fit to work with a lot of liberation movements on the continent. And they remained very supportive, especially on the left-wing side of African politics for much of the Cold War. And I think that is paying dividends, especially in the post-Cold War period, in which China has sought to entrench those relations further by establishing a more presence in terms of robust economic as well as military posture.
Let me bring in Anthony Goldman there, because you've very neatly brought me to that post-Second World War period and the Cold War, Andy, that obviously saw China, you might say, come in under the radar, dare I say it, into Africa to deal with those governments that were more left-leaning, more sympathetic. And of course, China itself, and I'm quoting here from Mao Zedong here, where he also described himself and China as being part of the Third World. They recognised and had an affiliation with parts of Africa that was very important in building up that relationship.
Yes, I think that as part of that, I think that there were projects that China began to engage with following on from that support for countries in southern Africa. So, for example, building infrastructure railway between Tanzania and Zambia that was seen as a kind of a landmark thing of the 1970s, a landmark achievement in terms of infrastructure. Mostly, I think, in that period of the Cold War, the most visible presence was actually the tensions between China and Taiwan, and that you could go to African capitals and see the competition, if you like, between Taiwanese-built palace or a Chinese-built national stadium. And in a sense, I think there's still an echo of some of that competition even today. China is still anxious that countries in Africa don't look too far to Taiwan for support. But on the whole, I think the tilt since the end of the Cold War has been much more in favour of China building up actual economic ties based less solely around strategy and diplomacy as support for the ever-increasing demands of Chinese industry.
Let me bring in Andy Mock there. I know you wanted to come in hearing our two previous speakers there, Andy, and without giving our viewers a full history lesson, which this programme is not, certainly China's influence in the region and on the continent has been long-standing and continues to be, certainly after this conversation or virtual conversation they've had this year.
No, indeed, Sahil. So I would just very briefly start with 1949, with the founding of the People's Republic of China, and you quoted Mao Zedong. I think from day one of the establishment of New China, the philosophy has been to treat Africa with a spirit of sincerity, genuine cooperation, and mutual respect. And I think that has been a common thread linking the decades since 1949 to today in terms of understanding the relationship between China and the continent.
Would you say, though, that you say that they wanted to try and treat all of those countries with equal respect, but there was also this Cold War between Russia and the United States, or Russia and the West, and they wanted to gain influence in Africa as well. Do you think that China itself at that time was also obviously very mindful of what its position could be or should be in the future if and when the Cold War ended?
No, certainly. And the world has changed tremendously since the early 50s. So geopolitically, of course, we've seen the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And China played an important part of that geostrategically. And from that perspective, I think certainly Africa has been seen as a battleground, maybe even a playground for, of course, colonial powers. And I think today as well, we've seen in the news, I'm sure, all this talk of the United States wanting to contest Chinese influence in Africa. But I think one of the things to point out, too, you touched on, Sahil, is that China has always seen itself as part of the developing world. And I think rightly so. Today, Xi Jinping says that China will never forget that it is a member of the group of developing nations. And if we go back to what Deng Xiaoping said about crossing the river by feeling the stones, I think what China has very clearly enunciated in the last few years is that it has found a way across the river and now is willing to show other people that path, but without imposing any type of ideology, foreign ideology, or any kind of political or economic mechanisms along with that, and letting Africa, other parts of the world, develop on their own terms.
OK, Anthony, can I then bring you in? Because obviously China may see itself in whatever terms it wants to, but China is viewed by some, i.e. the US, in terms of its influence across Africa as a bit of a bogeyman. I mean, they need a new enemy, you might say sometimes, this time an economic enemy, and that is China.
Yes, I think there's something in that. I mean, I think certainly at the beginning of China's new economic engagement with Africa, maybe 20 or so years ago, perhaps some of that rhetoric about China being a fairer partner, not having a kind of a neo-colonial agenda, that China had its own experience of rapid growth and taking people out of poverty, industrialization, that might have had some currency. I don't think it really does anymore. I don't think anybody in Africa really thinks like that. China is just, another potential source of financing, another potential competitor for projects. And I think I was speaking earlier this week with a senior official in an African country, said that perhaps it might be better if people worried less about what China thought of Africa and more what Africa needed from its partners. And I think that this the competition, if you like, between rival powers doesn't do a great deal for the people who ultimately are meant to benefit in terms of actually providing projects on their own merits, projects that are commercially viable and have less kind of this rhetorical baggage, from that makes more sense perhaps in Washington or even Beijing than perhaps in Burkina Faso or Zambia.
We'll talk about the specific economics in a moment, but Hassan Kanenji, can I just come back to you? Africa itself and its subsequent nations within the continent have had to deal with military coups, cross-border confrontation, climate change and famine, ethnic rivalries. Each country has its own beset problems. How has China, in your opinion, been able to maintain a good relationship with all of those different sorts of regimes and governments when they've had this whole range of problems across the continent?
I think China has learned from some of the mistakes that were done by previous powers, especially Europe and partly the United States, in part because it does not choose governments for Africans, and that is very attractive to African leadership, which more often sometimes is not accountable and sometimes they tend to be authoritarian. Secondly, African countries have found the path of Chinese growth relatable, in part because it's a country that is previously being classified as a third world, even though that's a political concept. But increasingly, of course, it's moving into the higher stages of being an advanced economy. But thirdly, I think because China looks at Africa as a partner and does not seek to involve in the internal affairs of individual African countries, it has allowed both friends and enemies within the continent to actually be able to work with China, irrespective of which government of the day is in power. And I think because of the kind of relations that it sought to build while it was relatively poor, and the perception of equal partnership that it's seeking to build, even at the cost of increased debt trap that most African countries are finding themselves in, China has been able to be successful in areas where, for instance, the West has failed. And in part also because it does not have the colonial baggage and is not viewed as negatively as some of the Western metropolis, even though, as I did mention, there is an increasing sense that a number of countries are sinking further into Chinese debt that is going to prove unsustainable in the near future.
There is this, Anthony Goldman, there is this real debate going on, isn't there, at the moment about Africa's resources, what China wants and what it needs it for in terms of its manufacturing and product base. I mean, when we look at some of the statistics, 6 countries make up 68% of total exports. Angola accounting for a third. Angola, Libya import oil from Gabon. Gabon also imports oil and manganese. The Republic of Congo, a series of reports we've had on Al Jazeera News, and the Democratic Republic of Congo extracts cobalt and copper. I mean, there's a lot of natural resources that China requires, and the balance of payments is lopsided as well. What Africa is able to buy off China is far less than what China, you might say, takes from Africa.
No, you make a very good point. I mean, Africa is not a country. Obviously, there's a huge distinction between the most favoured trading partners and some of those countries where maybe perhaps China has much less of a relationship. And Angola, South Africa are particularly important. I think we've seen some growth in West Africa in recent years. China's tried to crack Nigeria with different degrees of success, but I think that on top of the products that the raw materials typically that China seeks to secure from Africa, the energy security, mineral security it needs to support growth. In that sense, it is fairly familiar to the kind of patterns of economic engagement that other industrialized countries seek with Africa. One of the differences, perhaps, is that China, as a major manufacturer of cheap and cheaper products, is that actually there's quite a large informal trade that's perhaps not always captured in the official data between China and Africa. Quite a lot of that's dipped, obviously, because of the pandemic and the lack of travel over the last 18 months or so. But until that, there were regular flights direct from China to parts of Africa where small traders even were going and picking up petty goods, the things to sell at market. So I think that the picture isn't always captured by the big data, if you like, and I think that there has been quite a deep relationship from the top as well as the bottom with Africa, even where China's strategic interests do focus more on a particular and a small set of countries.
Andy Mock, Xi Jinping announced the fact that there would be less money being invested in Africa as a continent. That can be interpreted in many ways. One of the ways that it has been interpreted is that China is listening to what Africa needs and adapting its finances accordingly. Others are suggesting that China is walking away from Africa. What's your interpretation of it?
Well, I think the reality is much more complex and nuanced than to portray it in such black and white binary terms. And I want to back up a little bit to what the earlier speaker said about China learning some lessons from the European and perhaps the Americans in dealing with Africa. I would say it's much more profound than that, and that China brings a true sense of empathy in working with the continent, because China has not that long ago struggled with exactly the same issues, high mortality rates, malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's coming from a very, very different place. And the philosophy, the governing principles are non-interference and respect for each country's systems and choices. So I think that allows it to deal much more effectively with the countries of Africa. Now that then leads us to the current question, which you just asked. What is China doing now or going forward? I think it's important to recognize that China does not look at Africa as a patron-client relationship. But again, if we think about it as mutual respect, win-win, there will always be adjustments. We look at trade with Africa. It's been about $200 billion a year over the last 5 years or so, but it goes up and down based on exogenous factors as well as domestic market considerations. So I think that the longer-term direction is much, much greater interaction and integration with Africa. But we have to see how that unfolds in terms of investments, trade details, all kinds of other things, technical assistance. I believe China provides about 45% of its foreign aid to Africa.
Andy, let me just bring in Mr. Kanenji. You were nodding your head I think, in agreement with some of the points that were being made. But can I also add to whatever you might want to say now, in that Xi Jinping has said that he wants to open green lanes for African agricultural exports. He wants to speed up inspection and quarantine procedures, to increase the scope of products with zero tariff treatment to help achieve a goal, one assumes, of equality, of trade equality. Is that how you see it?
That is in part a response to an increasing sentiment of the continent that the balance of payments are heavily in favor of China. And therefore, China is trying to look for ways in which they can appease their African partners. It is important, though, that there's still the increased appeal of China, while economically it's seeking sometimes often to remake some of the African economies in its own image by following its own path. It does not seek to make Africa in its own image in terms of values. And I think those two things are the ones that have connected these two continents. However, I would look at the recent statements by the leader of China as more public diplomacy that is meant to actually appease leaders of the continent and generally the local population that has been complaining about increased Chinese influence in ways that sometimes disadvantages, especially local labor.
Anthony Goldman, I'll be coming back for this question both to you and to Andy Mock. But Anthony, can I just bring in, earlier in the week, we showed on Al Jazeera a report where Chinese mine officials had sanctioned the beating of a local man in the Democratic Republic of Congo for stealing cobalt rock. This was videoed, it was shown widely, we've reported on it. When Andy Mock says that, China's initial thoughts are always about empathy with Africa, being equal with Africa, understanding the needs of Africa, when you see video like this, it undermines that argument, doesn't it, about what China really wants? And this is the, you might say, the tag that Western media, Western governments grab hold of and say, you see, this is what China is really about.
Well, it does. And I think that there may be a difference between policy from headquarters and what actually happens on the ground. And certainly I think that that's not the only instance. You know, everybody is a cameraman now, and there have been a couple of instances from, you know, from West Africa as well, similar things where, you know, the relations at the coalface, almost literally, do deteriorate quite sharply. I mean, I think that that's probably true with lots of foreign companies, but the idea that China is somehow very distinct and much better in that regard is belied by the reality of events in a lot of places on the ground, including those where it's been captured in the way that you describe. And it's also true that in certain in some of those countries where China has had its most active engagement, it's also become a domestic political issue. In Zambia, there's certain populist mileage that political parties make in making an issue out of Chinese investments and other elements of Chinese policy, because although China was never a colonial power, obviously in Africa there has been quite a lot of immigration from China as part of its growth and of economic ties with Africa. And I think, you know, upwards of 1 million people have moved to Africa over the last 20 years from China, and that's concentrated in a few places, and sometimes not always with, you know, the most positive results. These are difficult changes to make, and not changes that happen easily or overnight.
Andy, can I come in for a brief comment from you on that as well?
No, I would absolutely agree. I think it's intellectually dishonest to attribute the actions or the misdeeds of an individual to a government policy. I mean, we all know that those of us that I'm sure all of us have interacted with large organizations, whether governmental or for profit. And one of the big challenges, and especially for Chinese enterprises working in a place far from home with a different language, different culture, different customs, that these are very, very difficult circumstances. And I think it would be surprising if some sort of mistakes or abuses did not happen. We also need to recognize mining is a difficult business as well. So these are unfortunate, and I think that they should not happen in an ideal world. But certainly, as far as I know, there's no policy on the Chinese side to condone these types of actions.
Hassan Kanenji, can I just come back to you now? Of course, Xi Jinping has promised 1 billion doses of the COVID-19 Chinese-made vaccine to the continent. Obviously, a welcome donation, but it comes in the context of the World Health Organization, who promised under COVAX that Africa would be looked after. Yet Western countries did nothing, did very little. We've been reporting it for 18 months. They've done something, but not enough for mutations to appear. China, again, helping out as much as it possibly can. Where do you stand on this? Do you see this as some sort of medical bribery in any shape or form?
No, I would say the extension of geopolitics, that are going on, especially between the Russo-Sino-Russian alliance and the transatlantic alliance. And I think while there was a lot of effort, especially from the previous administration in the United States, to paint China a lot more negatively as a source of COVID-19, it has worked its way into lots of hearts and minds of people, especially in the developing world. And so what this donation means, it is people are going to pay attention to those soft power aspects of China, which it has been doing more excellently, despite some of the propaganda that has been shared, of course, with regard to some of the human rights violations in terms of isolated incidents. And it's going to, I think, to go a very long way, because the West has largely not been as present, and especially Europe. The United States has been trying, but of course, I think it's grappling with its own issues. And there's a lot of vaccine nationalism that has limited the ability of the West to actually engage Africa in a way that is going to be appreciated in the long term.
I'm coming very close to the end of the programme. Andy Mok, can I just come back to you? Soft power, how important is that in terms of Chinese policy? Is it a word that's used? Is it a phrase that's used? And do you see this vaccine donation in that same sort of area?
Absolutely. So I think soft power is sometimes referred to in the Chinese context as discourse power. And in a world where we face global challenges and global responses are required, the ability to be heard, taken seriously, have one's views and opinions seen as legitimate is vital. And I think one of the big issues we're seeing here is in places with market-driven economies like the US, they are not able to overcome the structural limitations of for-profit companies wanting to protect their bottom line, whereas China is able to act in the interest of its country and the world. And I think this is an important factor in its increasing discourse power.
Well, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this subject in not too distant future. Sadly there, gentlemen, we have to leave it. Hassan Kanenji, Anthony Goldman and Andy Mark in Nairobi, London and Beijing. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman and the Inside Story team, thanks for your time and your company.